G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for race week 19 ahead of the US Grand Prix. As always, if you're new around here and are enjoying the content, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. So as always, this video is broken up into two components. The first, we'll look at how my team did in Qatar, all the kind of major talking points for each of the drivers and constructors that came out of the weekend. Secondly, we're going to look at how my team's shaping up for the next race, all of the dilemmas, team selection issues you're grappling with, and kind of take a look at a few different builds that you can consider ahead of the next race. Before we get into it, just want to call out FanAmp once again. They're a big supporter of the channel. And you'll see here, my team name for last week was Verstappen GOAT. The winner of a competition I have on the fantasy formula with Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ is, as part of the show sponsor, Fifth Gear Gums. They provide a $50 gift card giveaway for a weekly contest we have. The winner also gets to rename my team for the upcoming race week. And so the winner for the previous week, or 2 weeks ago, renamed my team Verstappen GOAT. Max did put in a very GOAT-worthy performance, and you'll see on the next screen my team's been renamed to something very different for the US Grand Prix. So all the details to enter, join the FanAmp community and the fantasy formula base on FanAmp are in the description below. Check that out, and you can go into the draw once you submit your entry into the competition to win that $50 gift card. So going back to my team, finished with 392 points. Pretty solid weekend across the board. Max obviously pretty good. I'd say there's only one other driver that had a better overall weekend than he did, and we'll cover that quickly. But it was a pretty solid outing for him as my extra DRS boost. We had the sprint weekend as well, so a lot of people were considering using the Limitless chip, the extra DRS chip. A few different swings in ranks as a result of the selections that were made. I used my extra DRS back in Austria. I'm planning to use my Limitless chip at either Circuit of the Americas or in Brazil, sprint race weekends as well. And I think they're the optimal times to do so. But I decided to not use either or any chips this weekend. As far as how the race kind of shook out, the sprint weekend, Oscar, pretty tremendous result. He started on P1 for the sprint. He won P1. Max and Lando finished behind him. And there was obviously a few noteworthy events that occurred in the sprint race. I think a standout for me was obviously the mix-up between Checo, Hulk, and Esteban Ocon. A lot of people were grappling with whether to go with Carlos Sainz or Sergio Perez. And at that point in time, I was obviously quite content with the decision I'd made, because obviously Perez got that -20 for not finishing the sprint. Not the same story for him on Sunday. He managed to make up a few positions from his qualifying position. Unfortunately, not a great qualifying for Sergio either. So a lot of people are looking to move him on for those that still own him. And then as for Carlos Sainz, as I said, looked like he was in the box seat between these two. But unfortunately, that fuel issue Ferrari discovered a couple of hours before the race meant he didn't even get to start the race. So I was pretty upset about that. He got hit with a -20 as well, and unfortunately ended the weekend on -14, 11 points lower than Sergio because of, I guess, the more points that are on offer during the Grand Prix. So not an ideal outcome, but I suppose in terms of how my team selection was looking the days before or the day before the deadline, it was for me either going to be Carlos Sainz or Yuki Tsunoda, or Sergio Perez and Logan Sargent. Now, I'll quickly just pivot over to F1 Fantasy Tools to give you, I guess, a little bit of a visual. I ended up choosing Carlos Sainz, which had he had -14, and then Yuki Tsunoda 11. So I guess my net result for the weekend between choosing those was a -3. Now Checo had -3, but poor old Logan Sargent got hit with a -34, which not only was a record for fantasy, the lowest fantasy score as far as I'm aware in one weekend, but it happened across both the sprint session and the race where he didn't finish the session. So he is a hard avoid for me. I unfortunately got burned with him the previous week with a -21 and had Checo then too. So I've been hit with a myriad of DNFs, and my rank has plummeted from the 3K mark I was at a couple of weeks ago to now 7.3. Not all that happy about it. So I think I need to kind of think about exactly where I want to put my money and I guess my decisions for my team selection. But Notwithstanding that, I guess I still made the right decision, albeit not a great one based on the outcome. McLaren, an absolute masterclass across the board. As I said, Oscar performed exceptionally well in the sprint with that P1. He finished P2 in the Grand Prix behind Max, and then obviously Lando had a P3 in both the sprint and the race as well. So pretty good result fantasy-wise. Obviously, there were a lot of variables at stake with the 18-lap maximum tyre stint Pirelli enforced because of tyre blowouts we saw in the previous year's Grand Prix. Not to mention that the temperatures the drivers were grappling with meant that they were pushing as hard as they could every single lap because of the fact that there was a shortened duration assigned to those tyres given that 18-lap life. The temperatures, the fallout with all of the drivers that were unwell, signs of, Ocon throwing up in his helmet, Stroll fainting in the car, Albon passing out in the medical tent, like an entire, I guess, debacle in terms of driver welfare. So hopefully we don't see anything like that again at any other circuit. And there's obviously processes they're going to implement to hopefully mitigate that risk going forward. But I guess other than Oscar lying down in the cool-down room after the race, a pretty non-event for most of my drivers there. So yeah, as I said, not a spectacular weekend with 392 points, although that seems to be above average for a lot of weekends. But for you engaged strategists, we're obviously seeing a lot more of you ascend up the ranks because of the fact that maybe you're just not getting hit with as many DNFs and we're all in on triple McLaren, which I think is certainly the play moving forward. So we're going to take a look at what my team is looking like for the Circuit of the Americas. As I mentioned, my team has been renamed for this race week to Red Bull Gives You Wins by the winner of that FanAmp competition. There are a couple of different lineups I'm looking at this weekend, and that's partly to do with the fact that I'm not so convinced still on Sergio Perez, and I guess what that means for the Red Bull constructor. Max, on a standalone basis, is far and away must own. But I suppose, given my cost cap at 0.0, I don't really have a lot of wiggle room. Now, I think logically, there are two kind of approaches I have in mind for this particular team build, and I think Triple McLaren are an excellent and the best value for money kind of asset in the game for drivers and constructors alike. I guess the predicament I'm grappling with is whether or not I expect Sergio Perez to struggle even more so at COTA. It's another sprint race weekend, and that is obviously going to have challenges within itself. I think, interestingly, Max, he's won the last two races here, so that I guess opens the door for the extra DRS boost, and we'll get and then potentially limitless too, with a number of other things I'll touch on momentarily. Sainz actually had pole position at Circuit of the Americas last year, so he's obviously got some confidence he can take from that, even though he didn't finish the race last year as a result of the DNF on the first lap. But I think what really interests me with regard to the circuit is that it is quite a wide snaking circuit, so there's a lot more opportunity for overtakes. I think that for a driver like Zhou Guanyu really kind of sits nicely for him, and a lot of people who are up on him certainly have the option to either stay or pivot to if you don't own him. But I suppose if I don't decide to go for a Red Bull, and it's going to be a hard decision for me to make, because Red Bull, if I look at a combination of Red Bull and Tsunoda, and this is one option I'm looking at, over the last 5 weeks combined, they've had 338 points. The other option I have here is, and I'll get to why I mentioned that specific number in a moment, I'm looking at potentially Alex Albon and the Ferrari constructor. Now, I don't necessarily think that this is a bad option. I really like Albon, and I think because there's 2 DRS zones, a number of straights, I certainly think he could finish in and around the points. He had P7 in the sprint in Qatar. He wasn't far off the points in the Grand Prix, and he finished the weekend last week with 23 points. So a lot of confidence can be taken for that. He's only raced at COTA twice, but I am confident that the Williams, with a number of kind of higher speed corners and lots of straights, should do quite well. It is just the Ferrari constructor that I'm most concerned about. I think if I want to go with Ferrari, I have to be confident that Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz are both going to be around kind of P2, P3, P4 across the weekend. So I definitely think that's possible. Charles and Carlos are both very competent drivers at this circuit. They were both P1 and P2 last year, but Max obviously ultimately ended up winning. So I think that's potentially one build for me, but I guess because Red Bull can be carried by a Max performance fantasy-wise every weekend, it makes it very difficult for me to part with them. If we go back to F1 Fantasy Tools down here, even when Sergio Perez has had some bad weeks, we look at the last three in particular, -3, -11, and 16, Red Bull still hit at the bare minimum close to 50 points a week. So that's clearly on the back of Max performing very well. And even when Max didn't win the race in Singapore, he still had a very, very good performance for the constructor. So I think that is probably the driving force behind why I'm finding it quite difficult to pivot away to Ferrari. And the reason why I'm inclined to go Ferrari over Mercedes is just because of, at the moment, the price difference. I think that 1.7, although it doesn't seem that big, is still quite material and is the difference between an Alex Albon and someone like Joe, which I think Joe is excellent, but I think Albon has slightly more fantasy upside in terms of points. He has had, the odd DNF here and there, but he can consistently get kind of the mid to high teens most race weeks. He had 23. That was, I think, one of his best, if not his best fantasy performance of the season. So I'm obviously very encouraged by that. And I think, Joe, if you do like this idea of a build, you could still certainly pivot to him. But I'm just not sure for me if, even with the overtakes on offer, I'm quite as incentivized to go for him if I had to choose between the two. So that's kind of one option if I decide not to go with Red Bull. Now, I still think, as I said, it's probably my favorite build at the moment, and I can't stretch to anyone higher than Tsunoda at the moment. So that's where I'm at. I mean, Liam Lawson, who will ultimately become Daniel Ricciardo, could be an option. I'm just reluctant to go for Ricciardo at the moment. He's on the back of his broken hand. First race back, and I know he loves Circuit of the Americas. He loves the US. I'm not suggesting it's going to be a distraction, but you compounded that with his wrist, or his hand, sorry. He's been out of the car for a few weeks. I'm just not sure if this is the right time to bring in Ricciardo when he is reintroduced to the game. As we have seen in the past, if you currently own Lawson, you will need to trade him out. It is not an automatic swap to Daniel Ricciardo. So just keep that in mind for you Lawson owners. Now, another option I have available to me in terms of my team is, and many of you will probably groan at this idea, is bringing back in Sergio Perez. Now, I know he has burnt many of these bridges with us the last kind of few weeks. His inconsistency is not all that encouraging. But I think an interesting point to make is that he's had two of his best results this season at sprint races in Baku and Austria. Unfortunately, it's been like the polar opposite, though, for the last two sprint races in Belgium, where he had 7, and obviously Qatar, where he had -3. He DNF'd in the sprint races in both Belgium and Qatar, but obviously had enough opportunity to make up overtakes, etc. on the Sunday in those sprint weekends to offset that. I guess the concern I have around Perez is obviously that qualifying performance. If he can kind of put it around P4, P5, and I've been saying it for weeks now, haven't really seen that, then obviously that Red Bull constructor and Perez has extremely high upside. But it is that risk of inconsistency that has plagued him so much of this season that Red Bull want him to rediscover. So I'm not so sure if that's a risk I'm prepared to take, particularly because on sprint race weekends, if he does have a poor qualifying performance, which he did in both Belgium and Qatar, he's maybe overplaying his hand just a little bit too much on the Saturday in the sprint race to make up for that poor qualifying position on Friday. So he can make a few extra points on the Saturday. Obviously, the sprint shootout dictates where you qualify for the sprint race. But I just worry that he's probably forcing too much on the Saturday to overcompensate for his disadvantage on the Sunday. And then, as we've seen in Qatar, put himself in a situation where he hasn't finished the race. The same again happened in Belgium. Whereas you look at Baku in Austria, where he had 61 and 51, he's just put himself from the outset way up the grid to start the race, hasn't had that pressure on him, and he's continued to drive well throughout that weekend. So ultimately, if I feel confident he can put in a qualifying performance, which isn't that confident at the moment, then this could be an option. That would leave me with absolutely no-go Logan Sargent, no-go Low, or Nico, who, although he had a very disappointing weekend with that DNF in the sprint shootout, he still, if we look at the race, he came away with the classic Nico Hulkenberg, loses a couple of positions in the race, but has a couple of overtakes. So you look at that in a vacuum, 2 points is pretty stock standard for him. Qualifying, as we know, even though that 15th is probably where you want him to be, isn't kind of typical for someone like him who can very much put it in the top 10 in most qualifying sessions. So he obviously had his weekend hurt by that DNF in the sprint. I don't think that's going to be a regular occurrence. Very rarely do we see him go below 0 points. So I think if you're looking for a safe baseline option for this build, Nico Hulkenberg could be an option. If you can get to Sonoda, I think this is also potentially something you could look at too. The last build, and this is very much a differential build, I think I'm a little high on Ferrari, and I probably more so than most, but I guess we're at the pointy end of the season where ranks are kind of certainly shrinking. There's a lot more of a gulf between everyone at every point, overall points, overall ranks. So I guess for people like me, I'm not particularly too concerned where I am at 7.3 in the world, but I would like to be a little higher. I'm probably a little far behind where I'd want to be. I'm chasing 1K by the end of the season, but we can only dream. Is to go for, I guess, a higher risk, higher reward lineup like a triple Ferrari. And the reason I say that is only because, as I said, the Ferraris had a really excellent qualifying at COTA last year. Carlos and Charles both started P1 and P2. Obviously, Charles Leclerc finished in the podium places, but Sainz obviously had that DNF. Now, you could, let me just show you firstly what this could look like, and then I'll get into the details of why I somewhat like this lineup. Well, for me personally, I can't stretch to it. This is a lineup, if you can get to someone like Nico Hulkenberg in this 5th slot, could be particularly appetizing. And the reason I say that is because Charles has finished in the top 4 in the last 3 races at Circuit of the Americas. He averages 22.5 points in his last 4 races. And I mean, if we look at this, I'm not going to say that, this is mind-blowing stuff, but Charles does have that explosive fantasy potential that very few other drivers do have. Now, the Ferrari is not the car we saw from last year, but I still think, and even though he has only scored above 30 once this season, when he does finish races, he's going to get a pretty solid amount of points each weekend. Sprint weekends as well. Look, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. Nothing spectacular, but 22 in Qatar, 26 in Belgium, 32 in Austria, and 29 in Azerbaijan. So pretty consistent production on a sprint race weekend. I think Charles does quite well at sprints historically as well. And he's only bested over the last 4 weeks in terms of fantasy points by Max, the McLaren duo, who I've spoken about quite a bit already, and Lewis Hamilton, who I think is in his own right a great fantasy asset, but just is too expensive, even though he is a couple million more than Charles. That extra couple million does really dictate kind of what the rest of your team could look like. So again, I'm not quite priced into this because I've been hurt by budget decreases the last few weeks, but I do really like kind of this triple Ferrari. The reason I go Oscar over Lando is because we've seen that Oscar can cover Lando's fantasy production for the most part. I think over the course of a race, Lando Norris is a better driver, but fantasy-wise and value for money-wise, Oscar Piastri is that guy. So if you are looking to be a little bit differential, you're chasing rank, and you think you want to take a punt on someone or something that could bear a bit more fruit, then I think triple Ferrari could be the play. Now, if you're like me and you've been burnt by budget changes, etc. this season, you could always, instead of Charles, get back in Lando Norris, and that would give you enough money to get 7.1. So, I mean, again, Me, classic, short by 0.1 million to get someone like Joe, but you could get someone like Yuki Tsunoda. No, I don't mind that either. I know it's kind of similar to the Carlos Sainz build and Red Bull build we had before, but it is very much trying to cater towards people with lower budget that are trying to make up rank in the last few races of this season. So there's a few different ideas that I've got. I haven't landed on any particular one so far, but I am looking forward to the practice session at Circuit of the Americas next week. I will be at the circuit, so I am a little reluctant to activate Limitless for the sole reason that I won't be in front of my computer that afternoon. I'll be kind of fiddling on my phone trying to make a decision at short notice. But notwithstanding that, I think it is an optimal time to use Limitless and Extra DRS given it's a sprint race weekend. I will be back with a final thoughts video next week. So I'll definitely digest all of the kind of chip options and other key talking points ahead of that. But I think I'll leave it there for now, guys. I appreciate you dropping by, and I'll see you all very soon.